In this video, we're going to practice what we've been learning in grids, and we're going to create this page that you see in front of you. And this page has quite a number of grids going on. It's pretty gritty, but it'll also be responsive. In other words, right now, we see this page is this is being responsive. We've got some menus going across the top. We've got some nice little picture here, some columns on the right, and then images, etc., etc. So then when I get down to the first breakpoint, then we should see, this is my first breakpoint. There it is. So now we see the navigation up and down instead of stacked or going across the top in columns. We see this image has now spanned across 2 columns and our packages are down below. We can see that our little award-winning icons and so forth, these things are starting to come underneath each other. We see this gets stacked, and then the final stack will be all of these are on top of each other. These 2 are on top of each other, so everything is now stacked in a nice even row. So that's what we're going to do, or even column. So that's what we're going to do in this particular example or practice video. I have given you some starter files, which are here and here. And so this is what you're starting off with. And what we're going to do then is we're going to just apply CSS to this page, which will give us the end result here. So that being said, let's just jump in and get started. I'm going to do copying and pasting because I think that's better than you having to watch me type. And you can always put the video on hold and or pause and follow along. So the first thing I've done is in my CSS is I've pasted in some variables, and variables is giving us the ability to assign a particular value. In this case, I'm assigning colors that might be repeating themselves throughout the code and or throughout the page or throughout the website, and I'm giving it a particular name. So we can do this, and you'll see how we're going to utilize this throughout the code. So if this doesn't make sense yet, just be patient and I will try and bring it together. So the idea here is that if I use this word dash dash, and you have to prefix these with these dashes, so double dash, dash dash primary, anytime I put this in my HTML, the browser will replace that word with this color and on down the line. And we'll see that when we do some examples of code. In fact, I'll just paste an example now. So I'm going to paste in some HTML formatting, and you can see right here that I've utilized that dark. So HTML, box sizing, font family, and color. And so for color, I use this word var parenthesis and dash dash dark. And so we're telling the browser, go look and see what I've defined dash dash dark to be. Well, the browser says, oh, I see that's hashtag 333, which is this dark color. It's hard to see in this background, but it's a dark black. And so utilize that for this color. And so the benefit to this is if we decide we're going to change that to a different color, then we can just change it up here. And every place where there's that dash dash dark then will get filtered with the new color. So from a maintenance standpoint, that's a little bit easier. So let's see where we are at this point. I'm going to save it. And we have a little bit of things applied. So we can see that our font families just changed. Box sizing simply means that if we change a size of something, that it doesn't affect our margins and border, or margins, padding, and border isn't affected in that. So that's what box sizing is. Other than that, that looks pretty straightforward. Okay, one more thing before I go into the HTML code. I'm going to add some body formatting. So we're just putting some background color again, utilizing this. There's only one place where I'm utilizing this color, so that's why I didn't put a variable to it. Margin, I'm setting up margins. Let's just see it happen. So we can see that the background color was filled in. Some margins around the edge of my body is filled in, so it pushes that content off of the frame there. And we set the line height to 1.4, so a little bit, almost 1.5 over the norm. So there's a body for it. So that's all pretty straightforward. All right. So before I go on, let me let's look at the HTML code. Pretty basic as far as HTML. We're not going to mess with that, but we have to at least understand the structure before we start putting CSS to it. So in your sample code, I've given you my Font Awesome link. So my kit, probably should put your own, but since I gave you it, there it is. What else do we have? So I've utilized some Font Awesome icons. So these little icons are all from Font Awesome. So I've utilized those in my code. Let's see what else. So if we look at this, we have a nav, and the nav is our navigation across the top. We have a wrapper in which we are wrapping all of our content in. I kind of went backwards there. So wrapper, and in our wrapper, we have a nav. We have some sections, section top container. So this information is, and I don't expect you to memorize this yet. We'll sort of see it as we go. But this top section, that's this piece right here. So our image and these two columns here. So we've got this top container that I call top section or top container. We have some boxes, and the boxes are these here. So you can see our font icons here, Font Awesome icons. And then you can see that there's 4 boxes, and each box contains an icon and a H3 and some lorem ipsum text. So there's 4 of those contained in this section called boxes. There is some, let's see, this section here, which is our info section. We have an image, and we also have a div that has a heading and some paragraph information, and then a button or a tag that we made look like a button. So that's this section here. And then we've got a bunch of images. So that is my section portfolio. And what you can do if you're where I got these, if you put this link into your browser, so I'll just do that real quick so you can see it happen. So if I put that link into a browser, it's just going to pull up random images. And this part at the end of the URL is the image size. So the reason why these are all different is if I had the same 200 on all of them, so if I put 200s right here, so yeah, these are both 200 by 200, then what's going to happen in my page here is it's going to bring in the same image. Oh, I didn't put it in the right one. I have to put in my practice one. So now you'll see that it'll bring in 2 of the same images. So if all of these were the same size, I'd have all the same image, which isn't my goal. So I'm just putting in different image sizes. I'm asking the page, give me one that's 200 by 201 by 200. And I can edit these images once I get them in. So what I'm using, the 200, 201, 202, 203 is just to bring in different random images. So that's all this section's doing right here. Then we have a footer, which is this part down here. Let me look at it from our example page. So we've got this little footer, and that's pretty much our HTML. And so with that in mind, I'm going to close up all of these sections so we can see this piece by piece. And so here we go. All right, so let's add stuff to our CSS so we can get this sample page. All right, so far we've got some HTML styling and we've got some body styling. Nothing too scary there. Next thing I'm going to do is all of these links here have a class of button. In other words, let me just show you. For example, read more. So if I scroll to the top and I see read more, and if you scroll down and look at buy now, so all of these have a class of BTN. And the idea is that I'm going to style all of those to look like a button. And so I'm going to take that BTN and we're going to give it some styling. Nothing too terribly out of the norm here. So let me make this bigger so you can see it. Okay. And I'll put this side by side so we can see them together, and gives you an opportunity to save the video if you need to in order to copy those in. But what you'll see now is that all of these look more like buttons, which was the idea. I got one more down here, so they all look like buttons. That's where your page should look like at the moment. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make our page utilize grids in order to make our page lay out in columns and be responsive. And so if we look back at, I'm going to close this back up. If we look back at our HTML, then again, we see that all of our content is wrapped in a class called wrapper. And so the first thing I'm going to do is put that whole thing, make all of my children, so the nav and all these sections, gritty. And in order to make them gritty, I need to make their parent display grid. So I'm going to do that next. So I'm just going to copy and paste in the code. So now that wrapper is display grid, and I'm going to give it a gap. So give you an opportunity to save that. If I look at my dev tools then, and again, this is Firefox, I'm utilizing Firefox here, and I'm going to go to inspect element. And the reason I'm using Firefox is because it happens to have a really nice little visual for grids. So I didn't save you can see from my circle there, I didn't save my CSS. So I'm going to save my CSS and refresh my page. And so by giving this display grid wrapper, the wrapper a display grid, not much has happened to my page per se. But if I come and look in my dev tools, I can start to see that, let's see, where's my grid? It's not big enough, just a second. Show me my grid. Oh, so here's my grid. It says div wrapper is a grid, so I'm going to click on it, and I'll start to see that my content is in fact being laid out in grids, although right now they're in columns up and down, and I'm going to want to adjust that. But for the moment, we can see it happen. You can see when I put my mouse over the grid down here in my dev tools that it's also highlighting the code up above, the page up above, so I can see that content. And then you can see in between those two grid boxes, the two purple areas, that there is that gap that I provided, which was grid gap 20 pixels. So now we're getting a visual of that grid being laid out in our browser. All right, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to play with our navigation across the top. So let's make these, we're going to make these items, grid items, and have them in columns across the top of the page here. So let's look and see where that is. So if I look on my line 16 here, and I open up that area, I have a div, I'm in a nav, and then I have a UL, which are the parent of my LIs. So we want to make our UL, which is the parent of the LIs. I want the LIs to show up in columns. So those are what I want to put into grid. So I need to put the parent in a display grid. So I'm going to do that next. So again, I'm just going to copy and paste some code in here for you. And then I'll just explain it. So let me push that up. Okay, so let's see what we have going on here. So I'm going to save it and refresh the page and show you what we ended up with. Hopefully I can put this all into view. Okay, so main nav space UL says if you are so go grab the main nav, which is here. And if you are a child, UL child of main nav, which this UL is, so any other UL on the page doesn't apply, just the UL of a main nav. Make that the parent, that's the parent of the LI, so we're going to give it a display grid. We're going to give the grid gap, so we should be able to see that in our dev tools. List style is simply getting rid of the bullets that are in front of the LIs, and padding. Grid template, repeat. Remember that 1 FR is a fractional unit. So if there are 4, repeat 4 times, so create 4 columns, each getting 1, in this case it'll be 1/4 fraction amount of space. So fraction is however much real estate is available, I get this amount of the pie. So since there's 4 columns, each column is going to get 1/4 of that piece, of that column. So let's look at it in our dev tools and see what we've got. So in our dev tools, let me make sure I refresh the page and I save it. Okay, so in our dev tools, I can see that I missed my scroll here. All right, so I'm going to unclick the div wrap and click the UL, and I can start to see that I've got 4 columns going across, as if it wasn't already obvious because they were going across the top of my page, but here I can see them displayed. I can also see that there are gaps in between the two, so highlighted here are those gaps that I laid out, grid gap 20. And so they're each taking up 1 fractional space, so they're taking up 4 even spaces across the width of my screen. Now, why are these extending so much further than this content? Well, let me close this up and share with you. If I scroll down further enough, we'll see this little image of the parasol and the chairs. And what's happening is that image is pretty large. And so the image is pushing this page larger than I really want it to be. In other words, my wrapper is being extended beyond where I really want it to go. So let me just demonstrate this, and hopefully this will help. So this parasol, let me just go to the info and show that that's an image. So here's an info. So image is extending beyond the width of what a section would normally want to be. And as a result, the page is getting extended farther than where it should be. So in a long-winded speech, what we're going to do is, and you can put it anywhere, I'm just going to put it here, that is an image tag. And what I'm going to ask the image to do is, I'm going to do max width 100%. So let me expand that so you can see it. Max width 100%. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And now let's watch our page and see what happens. So now what's going to happen is the maximum width image that you're allowed to be is the width of the container that you're in. So if you are larger than the container, shrink yourself up to be the maximum width that has been allocated to you. So that's what we did here. Our parasol image shrunk up a little bit. And what we're going to see now that our section is not being extended beyond what it normally should have been. Now we see that our words are a thing. Now we see our navigation is not extending farther than it should be. So now everything is the width of the wrapper, and we're all contained accordingly. That's hard to say. All right. Okay, so that's that part. All right, so now we need to do a little bit of cleanup on our navigation. So I'll add that. And hopefully you're able to see all that. Yep. Okay, so now we'll do a little cleanup. Again, I'm just going to copy and paste and get it in line here. And nothing fancy here as far as what I'm doing. So I'm going to save it, push it up so you can see it, and refresh. And now what you'll see is hopefully things that make sense. So again, I'm utilizing that variable that we defined up above with the colon root. I'll explain this block in a minute just to make sure it's obvious. Text decoration none. I'm getting rid of any of the underlining that the A tags leave by default. So here's what I'm working on. So remember, an A tag has an underline, so text decoration gets rid of the underline. I'm putting in some padding, centering the text, utilizing the variable up above to make the color of the text, the font color, transforming it all to uppercase, making it a little bit larger than normal, and then putting this nice little shadow, box shadow, around the outsides of each of those boxes. Now, just for visual, let me comment out display block and refresh this page just so we're clear on what it's doing. So an A tag by default is only going to be as wide as the content that it's contained in. So contact, this is only this big. The contact's a little bit bigger than home because there's more words in it. So when we give it, or letters in it, so when we get a display block, then what we're asking it to do is, okay, A tag, you have to behave like a block element, so you're going to take up the entire space that you were allocated. Okay? And so since we gave this a column, each of those A tags is going to be a block element, so it's going to take up the whole width of the column that it's set in, that its parent is. So that's a nice way to make those all uniform in size. Okay, next point is that we're going to deal with this section. Let's see. Oh, I was doing this wrong, so I'm going to get rid of this. And we're going to work with this top container. So the top container is this section in our example that has this nice image and some words and then 2 columns on the side. And if we look at this and we think of it in terms of a table, we have 2 rows, 4 cells, or even you can see that this picture is taking up 2 columns. So this looks like it's extending across 2 columns, and then there's a 3rd column, and it's also extending down 2 columns or 2 rows. So technically that's 1, 2, 3, 4 cells and 2 more cells over here. So I'm going to make that a little bit clearer here, hopefully, as I go along. All right, so let's look at our example. And here's where we're starting from. So it's this section right here. All right, so that section is the parent is called top container. So the first thing we need to do is give the parent top container a display grid. And then we'll do a grid gap of 20 pixels. And then as an example we did earlier, I'm just going to build on that. We did a grid template column. I'm going to set up 2 columns, 1 FR. And I know you can't see that, so be patient with me and I'll get this all lined up. And I'm going to save that. And let's just see what happens here. So I'm just going to do this piece by piece. Browser or the editor always wants to capitalize that for me for some reason. So anyway, back to small case, and now we should see some things move. Okay, so things have been moving, not totally clear. So I'm going to go to my inspect element so I can get this to show me a little bit clearer what the heck has just happened to me. So I'm going to click on this overlay grid and then section top container. Okay, and so you can see, starting to see that we've set up basically 3 columns, but 2 columns because you're taking up 2/3 of the 3 columns because that's what fractions do. And you're taking up 1/3 of the 3 total columns. And so we can see that happening here. And so the first box, which is showcase here. So showcase, class showcase, took up the top box, which took up 2/3 of the space. The second box, overnight package, took up this next column or grid or a cell, let's call it a cell. And then the next package took up the next cell, and then this cell is blank. All right, but we really want this showcase to span down these 2 columns. And we want weekend package and overnight package over here. So what we can do is we're going to take showcase, and we're going to do what we did in the last video. We're going to do row 1, 3. I'm going to save that and refresh it. And so now what we're seeing is that showcase started on row 1, or not row, but line number, and it extended down to line 3, which then moved the other 2 packages over to the next available space, overnight package and weekend package. So that's really doing what we wanted it to do, except there's an easier way or another way that we can accomplish the same thing. And I'm going to show that to you next. So I'm going to comment out these 2 lines just so you still have them for the progression, sorry, and then not scroll so much. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called named areas. And so again, just so you don't have to watch me type, I'm just going to type, copy and paste it in, and then I'll describe it, explain it. Okay, so all right. So what I've done is, in essence, given each of these areas, so we can see this now as 4 areas, I hope. Area 1, Area 2, Area 3, and area 4. And what I've done then is I've given each of those areas a specific name. In other words, both of these cells, because I made 2 columns, remember we did 2, each of those I'm going to call showcase. I'm also going to call this showcase. Wait, what? And then these top areas 1. Let me just show you here. Let me keep expanding on this idea. See here it says display area names. And so when I click on that, it should have shown the area names. I didn't say save. That's why you always have to save when you're demonstrating something. Let me refresh, and now you'll be able to see the names. So now you'll see each of those, think of them as table cells that we've spanned. We've combined these 2 table cells. So we're actually wanting all 4 of these to be called showcase, because the idea is all of these are going to expand over or span over 2 columns and 2 rows, which is why we're calling all of these showcase. In other words, showcase is going to share all of these spaces, and then weekend package and overnight packages are going to share top 1 and top 2. Don't quite understand that. Let's just finish up with this idea, and hopefully it'll bring it together. And so showcase, I want to plop in where these showcase words are. Now these words could be anything. They can be showcases. I just gave them a name to match so that I know that this is where my class showcase is going to go, but I can do it this way as well. So if I did it that way, save and refresh, now you'll see that this is showcases. Just if that's less confusing, just recognize that these are just words I gave it. They're random, and I'm going to plop showcase into showcases. In other words, let's just do it. And so I'm going to call it grid area. The grid area where I want you to exist is in showcases. Showcases. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing with top 1. So this is called top box A. So top box A. I want you to exist in top 1. So I want to plop you down. I want to plop you into this space. So I can do grid area, and we call that top 1. And I'm going to do the same thing for, I can just do it this way. So top box B, I want to plop you into this space I've called top 2. So I'm going to do top box B. You're going to go into grid area top 2. So now save and refresh, and what we should do is we should see exactly the same thing happening. So showcase got plopped into, showcase being this header, this class here, where the header is, this class gets plopped into wherever I have the word showcases. So I've defined 2 columns and 2 rows with the word showcases. So you are going to go into all of that area. And then you, top box A, are going to go into top box 1 or top 1. And you are going to go into top 2, which is here. So you can see that happening here. Okay, and you'll see where this is really going to come in handy when we do media queries. Whew, that was a lot of work, wasn't it? But pretty cool. All right, so now we just have to do a little cleanup of this particular area. And so let's see. I'm just going to copy and paste in some code. And so in Showcase, the first thing I'm going to do is put in a background. So we have this lake image in our folder called images and then lake. So let me refresh that and see what happens. Okay, sweet. I don't need this in the short run, so I'm going to make this go away. And so in the short run, I've got this image, but the image is a lot larger than the area that I've contained to 400 pixels, maximum height 400 pixels. So I'm going to add in another property that will make sure that, let me just paste it in. So the idea here is you want to, browser, I want you to take that image and make sure if you have to shrink it, whatever you have to do, but contain that, make that entire image fit inside this space that I've allocated. So it shrunk up my image and maybe stretched it. It could be, depending on the image, it might skew it or stretch it, but it's going to stretch it so it fits completely around that, inside that image that I've provided. Probably add a little padding, and then add a little padding, and I'm also going to add a shadow around this box. So let's just do that and save it. And now what you should see in the end result is I've applied some padding around the items, around these outside here. Let me just do it with Inspect Tools so I can see what you're referring to. And so if we get that container and I grab Showcase, you'll see that there is some padding around. See the purple? Padding around my content. What else did we do? A box shadow around the entire element. So if you look outside of the purple shaded area, you should see the nice little box shadow that we applied. All right, so we also need to do a little bit of cleanup to Showcase's text. Showcase's text has some H1 and some P elements in it. So I'm going to just copy and paste my code for Showcase H1. Put it up here so it's part of Showcase. So Showcase H1. So just the H1 inside of the Showcase. Here's my header Showcase. So only the H1s that is inside as a child of Showcase is going to receive this styling. I had margin bottom in there, which I don't think really is doing anything because it already has a margin bottom. So that's why I commented it out. Anyway, so we made our font color. I didn't save it. So our font color should be light, whatever light was set up in our variables up above. And our image, our text is going to be 4 times the size that it would have been by default. By default, it is 16. So this should be 32. And I think, let's see if we can do this. So if we go to computed and we look at font size, 16 times 4, the default is 16. We're giving it 4 times the default, which is in fact 64. So there's a nice little additional for you. All right. And then the P tag then is also inside our Showcase. P tag was given 1.3% of its normal size, margin top, and then the color. All right. So far, so good. Now we have to handle the 2 boxes on the side. We're going to give it a little bit of additional formatting and styling. And so to do that, what I will do is notice that both of these divs have also besides top box A, they each have a class that they share called top box. So I can style them both at the same time using top box. And so I'm going to just paste my code in here, and top box is giving it a nice background color, again, based on the variable I set up above. I'm going to give it a display grid so that I can make it columnar or however I want to do that, and you'll see that as we progress. Any of the values that you utilized or that we learned in flex boxes, you can use here as a grid as well. So justify item center is giving me the ability to center the elements within the grid. And then box shadow and some padding. So let me save that and see it happen. And now you'll see some nice boxes of form with some nice shadows around the edge. So if you're not sure, like I don't really understand what justify item center does, well then just comment it out and then refresh it and you'll see what happens to it. So now they're not really aligned very well. And so if I redo the justify center, item center, now you'll see that they center themselves a little bit cleaner. So if you're not sure of something, just comment it out and see what the results are. Okay, close this out, and the next section we're going to work on is the boxes. And so the boxes are these elements here, and each box, so we're all put into a section called boxes, and there's 4 boxes, and each one has a class of box. Each one has a font awesome icon, and then some H3 and a P tag. All right, so I'm going to get to the bottom of these, And now let's work on the boxes section. Okay. So, boxes. So something I can apply to all of them. The editor keeps wanting to make these capital and I don't understand why, so let's fix that. Okay, so boxes. So let's just do some basic styling to make them look a little bit better. Make sure I put a semicolon here. All right, and then let me save that. It is saved, and refresh. So let's take a look at that to start with. So background color, text align center, some padding, and some box shadows, which is this part around here. So we've got a box shadow. We've just applied some styling to our big section. So this whole piece, and in that whole piece, we now have given it a background color of the primary color that was set up above in our variable section. Text align center, looks like they're all centered. They've received some padding, so top and bottom, left and right. And then it has a shadow around the edge. So far, so good. So the boxes is the parent of each of these individual box. And so we're going to flex the individual box inside the boxes. So that just sounds awful if you're passing by. All right, so we need to make the parent, which is boxes, a display grid so we can make the children gritty. And I'm going to give it a grid gap like I always do. Grid gap 20 pixels. All right, so nothing fancy yet. So we're going to want to put these into columns. And so I'm going to use grid columns, grid template columns. And I know you can't see that, so let me close this up a little bit. Let me make this so we can see all of it. There we go. Not quite. I know it's frustrating for you. It's frustrating for me too. It's hard to put these all together so we can see it all. Okay. All right. So here's the code. Grid template columns. Repeat. So repeat whatever's in here. So the first part of a repeat is how many times shall I repeat? And we did that earlier with maybe a 3, or I think we did it with the navigation. We did 4. But instead of 4, we're using the word auto fit, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then min max says at the minimum, I want each column to be 200 pixels. So each of these needs to be no less than, it can't be 150. Each one of these has to be at least 250 pixels wide. I said 250, I get my numbers mixed up. Each of these must be 200 pixels wide at the least, can't be any less than that. And then have each of those extend to take up 100% of the space that it has available to it. So AutoFit then, instead of giving it a hard-coded number, you're telling the browser, if you can't fit 200 pixels across, then put it on the next line. So this is how we're going to be responsive. Make sure I save that. So let's just look at it and watch it happen. Let's refresh. Okay, so the browser's saying I can put all of these columns, I can make each of them at least 200 pixels wide. So let me see if I can explain what's happening just to be clear. So if I look at each of these, let's make sure we're grabbing them. So these are boxes, okay? So each box is at least 200. It needs to be 200. So these are all 200 pixels or more. So the browser says each of these can be 200 pixels, and I can fit them all across here 4 times. So because I can fit them across here 4 times, each of them is going to get 1/4 of the space available to it. So your column is going to be 1/4. 1/4. Each of these columns are going to be about the same width, 221.75, 221.75. So each column is taking up 1/4 of the space, and they're at least 200 pixels wide. Okay, so AutoFit then is saying, let's make these a little bit smaller. Okay, so now the browser realizes that it can't fit this 4th element alongside the rest of them because it doesn't have enough pixel width in order to make that happen. So AutoFit then says, that's fine, just put it on the next line down. If you can't fit it 200 pixels wide, then put it on the next line down, which is what it did. And so now the fractional piece says, because each of you are taking up one fraction, you're going to take up a third because it fits 3 across, right? So each of these is now a third of the width. A third of the width because they're 1 FR. A third of the width. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's what we're doing here. So to some degree now, this is going to be, not some degree, it is, it's being responsive. So now we don't have to worry about this piece being responsive. Okay. Up above here, still not quite responsive because as we squish it together, it's not really doing anything, but we're going to fix that in a moment. So we're getting responsive. We have some more work to do with some media queries, but by using this AutoFit, this portion is going to be responsive by itself. Whew, that's a lot of work. Okay, so that's the code for the boxes. Okay, so now let's work on this info portion. So we've got the info portion. Let me put it in our HTML so we can see it. The info section is right here. The info section has this image. And it also has a child of div. So if we do a grid, which we're going to do, we're going to make this section gritty. So we need to make the parent display grid, which is going to make just the children. Let me make that clear. Just these two items will then be gritty or available for grid columns. And then whatever's inside the div is going to behave individually or separate or outside of the fact that these are not going to be gridded. Remember what point I'm trying to get across here in a very poor way is remember that if a parent is display grid, only the direct children are going to receive the values for the grid. So let's put that into action to make it make more sense. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we're going to apply some styling to info. So I'm going to do a comment info section. And we're going to apply some styling to info. Why do you keep capitalizing that? I don't know. Got to figure a way to make that not happen. Okay. So info, what are we going to do to info? Well, let's give it some styling first of all, and also the display grid. So the info is this image along with read a book, lorem ipsum text, and our little button. So I'll start with that and refresh. Okay, looks like we need a little bit of padding, so I'm going to add some padding. We'll do something like padding 3 EM, and let's see what we've got. All right, so we've got something that looks nice-ish. We've got a little bit more work to do, and that is, let me look at my example here. So my example shows that I've got this shrunken image taking up this column, and then we have a second column of our children, which is going to be this H tag and our lorem ipsum and our button. So we need to set up two columns side by side. So we don't have that, so let's do it now. All right. So next thing we do is set up the column. Remember, we use grid template columns, and we're going to want two columns. Spelling. This is why I do copy and paste. Grid columns, and then what we're going to do is we're going to have, I'm going to repeat twice 1 FR. So I'm going to create two columns, and they're each going to take up, in this case, since there's only going to be two, they're taking up half of the amount of space that's allocated to them. So let's just see that happen. And so just to reiterate again, make sure that we're on page here. Info, we set up the parent as a display grid. Each of the children are going to be put into columns. In this case, two columns, and each of those are going to take up one fraction of the amount of space. Well, that's 50% in this case. So each of the children, which is an image, and also the div is going to take up 50% of the total amount of real estate available. And then the children of the div are just going to do what the children of the div, what a normal HTML would do. They're not being included in this div properties, this div functionality. All right, so info looks good. Okay. And the next thing we're going to deal with now then is the portfolio, which is the next section down. So let me shrink this up so we have that. Portfolio is all of those images. So we're going to make these a little bit cleaner and a little bit more responsive. So I'll type in portfolio, portfolio section, and then control// to comment that out. And now we'll do portfolio. And there's that capital P. So let me just copy and paste in for you. So let's talk about the portfolio. I'm going to copy in some code. So portfolio, the parent of these images is this section called portfolio. So we're going to display grid the parent, going to give it some gap. And then, I guess you can't see this, so let's clear this up for you. There we go. So save and refresh, and let's see what we get. All right, so the parent has been given a display grid. We've got the display gap. And if I look at my inspect element, you can see that in your grid. So let's just verify that. So here's my section portfolio. And it looks like I have a very even grid set up. And so what's happening here is, let's look at the grid template columns. So repeat, there's that auto fit. So remember, if the guidelines, if you can't follow the guidelines, then just put it on the new line. In other words, the guidelines are, I need each of these columns to be at the minimum 200 pixels wide, which is what's happening here. Okay. And each of those columns, therefore, needs to take up one fraction of the total space. So in this case, we have 3 columns. So each of these columns is going to take up 1/3 of this space allocated. And you can see that because there's some space here after the images. So here's column 1, and it's extending itself 1/3 or 33%, if you will, across the page. So if I made this screen bigger, again, now they're taking up 1/4 of the space because there's 4 columns, and we can see this gap after each of the images. So you can see that those columns are being created, and there's the grid gap that we gave it. So what I'm going to do on top of this, because right now it looks a little wonky, if you will, let me get rid of this layout so we can see it. So this isn't too bad, but let's look at the 3-column one. When I do the 3-column one, again, my images they're not lined up real well. I've got some really uncomfortable spacing, although the columns are spaced nicely. So I've got an even column, but my images look wonky. So what I can do is, hopefully this will make a little bit more sense when I actually put it into play. So I'm going to paste this code in. And what I'm saying is, for all of the images, kind of what we did up above, I want those images to take up 100% of that width. So right now they're just taking up whatever real estate, however big they usually are, 200 pixels I think is what it was. So now go ahead and fill in this gap, be 100% of the width, and then put a little shadow around each of those boxes. So each of those images has a nice shadow. So let's refresh that and see if that happens. Apparently you have to save. That is the theme, save. So now that we save, you see those images are taking up the full width of the columns that they've been provided, and they've got a nice little shadow around them. So untick this so we can see it, and there you go. So now things are lining up a lot nicer in this particular section. All right, looks good. So now let's move down to, well, that's a weird picture. Okay, let's move down to the footer. And so the footer is pretty straightforward. There's nothing really too complicated as far as my code's concerned about the footer. The footer should extend across the page there. Again, I'm just going to copy in some code, save it, and it should look nice across the page. Excuse me. And we're good to go. Oh my goodness, lost my voice. Hang on just one. All right, don't know where my voice went, but now it's back. Okay, so now we're going to deal with some media queries, and I think you're going to like this, hopefully, because now we've got the hard stuff out of the way. So let's look at our example. In our example that we are trying to replicate, which is this one, what will happen is, okay, so remember we had a breakpoint here, and when we had a breakpoint, that column that we had to the right of our chairs has now come down underneath the chairs. I think I missed the point up here. Okay, so our image, remember the showcase is now extending across 2 columns, and our other 2 columns came down below. And then our navigation is now stacked instead of side by side. And these were we already had these working, so that's nothing cool yet. But all right, so let's look at our work in progress and see if that's happening for us. So when we bring ours together, let's go back to the top. When we bring ours together, our navigation it's just shrinking. Our showcase and these columns are just shrinking because they're not really working yet. These are doing a good job because we use that auto fit, so that's very good. And the side, and I just thought of this, and I apologize for going out of sync, but I do want to bring out, I have noticed some students when they're doing these examples, if they have auto-fit, their images aren't shrinking up. So if that's happening to you, get rid of the hyphen and see if that fixes your problem. I can't tell you why sometimes auto-fit works and sometimes it doesn't. I don't have an answer to that query, but I do know that is happening for some students. So I apologize for sidestepping, but I just happened to think of it because I saw it. All right, so coming back to where I was, these are automatically doing their shrinking and growing, so I don't need to worry about that for our media query. But I do need to worry, and this one also, I need to move somehow this column below the little parasol thing, so image. So let's work on that. So the next step then is media queries. All right, so at media, in the past we've been doing like screen and then we did, I'm going to do a 700 max width, 700 pixels. So the idea here is if the screen is shrunk below 700, then do something. Another way to write this, if you didn't want to write all that out, you can also do, or if you see this in notation, same idea here. So that works as well. We're just not being specific to a output, whether it be a screen or a printer. All right, so if the screen shrinks below 700 pixels, then we're going to do something. All right, so I want to bring you back to, remember up above here, let's go back up to where we were at one point in time in our lives in this video. We were here and we created this grid template and we told the showcase gets plopped into these spaces, and we told somewhere down here, we told where did we do it here? We said top box 1, which was the overnight package, gets plopped into this location. So for media queries, what we're going to do is I'm just going to copy this code and I'm just going to redefine what the template area looks like. The browser already knows where to plop these things in, so as long as I use the same names, I can just redefine the template. What? Let me explain. So I copied that. So we're going to go back to top container. And I'm going to paste the code in that I had up above, except I'm going to redefine it. And the redefinition is going to be, now I want showcase to be across the top 2. So showcase span 1 and 2, and then overnight and weekend package is going to be down below. So really now I have 4 cells, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's just make that happen. And so showcase, I am going to extend across the top, and then 1 and 2 is going to come across the bottom. So top 1 and top 2. So I've redefined what that template area looks like. I've already told the browser where to plot these items. And so if we make this smaller, that should just work. Let's see what happens. So let me bring these down. And that didn't work. What did I fail to do? Oh, stupid browser or editor keeps making that capital. Okay, make it smaller. Okay, now let's try it. And so now you can see that's exactly what happened. And if we go back to our dev tools and look at, let me bring this up. Let's go back to our dev tools and click on that container. We should see those new named values. And so now we can see that this is showcase, and top 1 and top 2. So super easy to do media queries. All right. So now let's address, I'm going to close this out. Let's address our navigation bars. So these navigations, we set those up above. Let's look at what we did up above here. Navigation, navigation, navigation. Navigation we set up with grid template, and we set that up with 4 columns. So let's just, I'm going to copy that code and come back down to my media query and say, well, now if you're below 700, then let's take that main spelling nav, and it was UL. I'm going to copy that in, except now instead of 4, we're just going to do it. In fact, it'll just make it even. You don't even need repeat. I can just do, each one of those should take up 1 FR. Oops, FR. Okay, so let's see that happen. Okay, so now instead of taking up 4 columns, each one of them is going to take up the full amount of space that's allowed. So 100% in this case. 1 column, 100% wide. Okay, let's see if there's anything else we need to accomplish in this. We can kind of clean up this button a little bit. So I'm just going to copy that code in, and let's see what that does. So for the info button only, for this button, if we make it display block, then it'll extend. Remember, we did display block a little earlier, so it's going to extend that across the whole page and align the center. Let's just see that happen. And so now you can see that button is taking up the width of the container that it's in, and then text align center. Okay, so just a little cleanup, and we're good to go. All right, so we've got one more scenario, and that is when we have one more breakpoint. We're going to make this point below 500. Then these two should stack, and I think the rest is taking care of itself. So now we've just got one more scenario, and that is here where we are right here. So these should stack now instead of being side by side. So right here. So now they're stacking on top of each other. And I think the rest of that is doing what it's supposed to do. So let's do one more media query. At media, and this time we're going to do max width of 500 pixels. So if you get below 500 pixels, all I'm going to do is redefine this template area. So I'm going to take this. Remember, what we're working on is this part right here, right? So I'm going to redefine this template area just like we did up here, except this time, instead of having showcase extend across, I don't want it to extend across. I want to create just one column. And then I'm going to push this one down one column. There we go. And so now, let's line that up nicely. So now showcases should be on the top, and then these should become stacked. So let's save that and refresh it and see how we do. So if we bring this further down, then they should get stacked. So now in 500 media, I've got a 500 pixels or less. I've got a very stacked web page. So very responsive now with 2 different breakpoints, and everything looks pretty cool. Whew, that was a lot of work. So hopefully out of this video you got a lot of how much easier life can be, responsive and otherwise, with grids. Hope you enjoyed the practice.